And what's amazing, you and I talked about this, Pastor, when the temple was destroyed and the sacrifices ceased, it was right in the middle of that 7-year Jewish-Roman war that lasted from 66 to 73. Many people erroneously think it was just 3.5 years. No, it was 7 years, but in the middle of it is when Commander Titus and his Roman legion went in, breached the walls, destroyed the city, destroyed the temple. And as a result, the animal sacrifices that the Jews were still doing, they shouldn't have been doing those came to an abrupt stop. But the war itself did not end for another 3.5 years. And so there's 7 years, which I would argue is a shadow of your end game 7-year period here talked about in Revelation.
Yeah. And just like Antiochus Epiphanes with the Grecian Empire is a shadow fulfillment of that 7-year period with the abomination desolation that's mentioned in Daniel. Also, obviously, which is why, when you're reading in Luke 21 and you're reading in Matthew 24, where there's a lot of similarities dealing with the fact of what happened in 70 AD and what happens in the future. And you have to realize that there are what we would call dual fulfillment, or maybe a shadow fulfillment to ultimate fulfillment. And so, I'll give you one example of this, and there's many obviously in the Bible, of a dual fulfillment, or basically like a shadow fulfillment, if you will.
Right.
Is John the Baptist. So John the Baptist is his own person, right? But he came in the spirit and power of Elijah. And Jesus even said, this is Elijah, which was for to come. But, in Malachi, it says, Elijah the prophet shall come before the great and terrible day of the Lord, right? But also what the Bible teaches is that there's going to be 2 witnesses. And I don't think anybody disputes Elijah being one of the witnesses. I think they're usually saying, is it Moses or Enoch? When it comes to who they're disputing. I believe it's Moses and Elijah. But Elijah, the person, is going to come before the day of the Lord comes, because he comes when the abomination and desolation is set up, and him and Moses, I believe, will be witnessing in Jerusalem. And then they're going to be killed before the 7th trumpet is blown and all that. So, there's a picture of a shadow fulfillment of that with John the Baptist when he came in the spirit and power of Elijah. But then the physical man, Elijah, I believe, is going to be on the scene right before the day of the Lord. So,
okay. So typically what we see then in terms of dual and sometimes triple prophecy fulfillments, like with the transgression or abomination of desolation, we see an immediate fulfillment, correct me if I'm wrong, that is oftentimes spiritual, as you pointed out. And then in the future, so near and far, your far fulfillment is more physical and literal. Not always, but oftentimes we find that.
Yeah, well, specifically dealing with end times, what you'll find is you'll have a localized example of something that's going to be bigger. So think about the day of the Lord, right? The day of the Lord is mentioned a lot in the Old Testament. And look in the book of Joel, and it says the day of the Lord is at hand. But there is literal days of the Lord that would happen where God would judge and punish and things like that. The day of the Lord in Joel was talking about how he's going to send this army of like caterpillars and locusts and all this stuff and destroy the land. But then there's other places where the day of the Lord is doing something else. And so, but then you're going to have the day of the Lord.
Right.
And what you see is that there's going to be antichrists, throughout history, and there's going to be tribulations throughout history, and God's pouring out his wrath throughout history. But what you see in the book of Revelation is a culmination of all of that, meaning that you have the greatest tribulation such as the world has never seen or ever will see, right? But then you also have this wrath that's being poured on the earth that the world has never seen. So, and a lot of times what you'll see with the wrath is like, oh, I remember seeing that in Exodus, right? I remember seeing that with, the water turning into blood. It's like, but that's just one aspect of the judgment that's coming on the earth, right? And so, that's what you really see is that ultimate fulfillment of all those pictures and shadow fulfillments of the day of the Lord, all those shadow fulfillments of, let's say, the Antichrist and what he's trying to do, whether it's Antiochus Epiphanes, or whether it's going to like Titus or something like that in Rome, you know, they all are picturing the ultimate fulfillment that's going to come in the end.
We have many appetizers and to the main course. The main course we read about in Revelation. You see it right in Genesis with Adam and Eve, right? They were told that they're going to die if they ate of the forbidden fruit. And there was an immediate fulfillment because they died spiritually, but they were doomed to die physically. And so you have a near and far, a spiritual fulfillment, and then a physical fulfillment because eventually they died physically. One that I like to point out, Pastor, an easy one for people to understand, Abraham, when he was offering up his son Isaac on the altar, God said he'll provide himself a lamb, right? But what actually happened was a ram was offered up. So it met that context. But in the future, the literal lamb, the lamb slain from the foundation of the world, Jesus Christ. So we have a near and a far more literal fulfillment.
Yep, definitely.
So I wanted to point out here in my slide, there's nothing new under the sun. So history repeats itself. God works in prophetic cycles where you have these appetizers or these shadows to the main event, the end game. I think one example in my study is Antiochus Epiphanes, who fulfilled a lot of these prophecies in a localized manner, as you said. Like Matthew 24, we see localized fulfillments. But there's an analog in Revelation 6 where you see all of the same events, but described in a more universal manner, worldwide versus local. And so Antiochus Epiphanes, you see through the power of the dragon, who's Satan, the serpent, he is doing a number of things that the end times Antichrist, Daniel 7, Revelation 13, is also doing. And so I was wondering if you could briefly speak to the significance of Daniel 8 and the vision, consider this vision and how that links to Daniel 9, but also Daniel 11.
Yeah, so I guess it gets into, the big question when it comes to end times prophecies, Daniel 9, 26 and 27, and what's going on there. And I think first of all, when you're looking at the 70 weeks that are being accomplished and everything, if you look before you get to that point in Daniel 9 in verse, he's praying, basically Daniel's praying to God about the sins of his people. And he's praying about specifically 70 years that are to be accomplished. So Jeremiah prophesied that there's going to be 70 years of captivity. And he's praying about that. And then Gabriel is going to come to him. So in verse 20 there, it says, and while I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God. Yea, while I was speaking in prayer, even the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning. Okay, so Gabriel's only mentioned twice in Daniel, and that's in Daniel 9 right here and Daniel 8. And that's what he's referring to is Daniel 8 with the vision that Gabriel was showing him, or basically declaring unto him the meaning of it. It says, being caused to fly swiftly, touched me about the time of the evening oblation, and he informed me and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I am now come forth to give thee skill and understanding. At the beginning of thy supplications, the commandment came forth, and I am come to show thee. For thou art greatly beloved. Therefore, understand the matter and consider the vision. So, what vision? Well, the vision that's just mentioned in verse 21, which is the fact that that's the vision that Gabriel was declaring unto him in chapter 8. So, I believe that when you're going into the 70 weeks, notice what it says in verse 24, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression and to keep and to make an end of sins and to make reconciliation for iniquity and to bring in everlasting righteousness and to seal up the vision and prophecy and to anoint the most holy. That we are to be considering this vision that's in Daniel 8 with what's about to be said, okay, in these 70 weeks. And so when you read this, obviously it talks about restoring Jerusalem, restoring the city, to build Jerusalem and all that, and talks about Messiah the Prince coming. Well, after the 62 weeks there, Messiah's cut off in verse 26, but not for himself. So we know that's talking about Jesus dying for the sins of the world. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. I believe that's clearly 70 AD of the temple being destroyed. Okay, so, but it says the people of the prince that shall come. So it's not the prince that's destroying, it's the people of the prince.
Right.
Okay, so this goes back to, okay, well, who's this prince? But it says the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. Then it goes on to say, he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon desolate. So when we're talking about this last 7 years of the 70th week, I believe we're talking about the prince that shall come, not the Messiah, but the prince that shall come is talking about that little horn in Daniel 7 specifically, but we are to look back at Daniel 8 because there's 2 little horns mentioned in Daniel. There's the one that comes out of the Roman Empire, with the 10 horns, the beast that has 10 horns. But then you have Daniel 8, where you have the little horn coming out of the Grecian Empire, which is that Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, the thing is, though, no doubt Antiochus Epiphanes happens before Christ comes on the scene. Okay, so anybody, obviously history, that the Grecian Empire is before the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire was there when Jesus was crucified, right? So we are to look at that, and then when you look at Daniel 8, what you'll see when it's being explained or that vision is talking about the sacrifice being taken away and the abomination. It says, I'll just what it says in Hebrews 8:13. Then I heard one saint speak, and another saint said unto that certain saint, how long shall be the vision concerning daily sacrifice and transgression and desolation, and to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot? And then it goes on to say 2,300 days. And this is where the daily sacrifice is taken away. And it says in verse 12 there, it says, and host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression. And, this is what I believe is that abomination, desolation. Okay, so, and this is where we see Gabriel mentioned, and he is explaining this to Daniel. Okay, so it says in Daniel 8 that the Antichrist, or this little horn that's mentioned here, is going to stand up against the Prince of Princes. But the interesting thing is that Daniel 11 is a reiteration of Daniel 8. So Daniel 11 is really just, if you're to look at this as more information about Daniel 8, when you're dealing with the Persian army being taken out by the Grecian army. And then you have that big horn, the notable horn, that's Alexander the Great. He dies, and he obviously dies at a young age, but then there's 4 kingdoms that come out of that. And Daniel 11 really gets into more detail about that aspect of it. But the thing that I want you to see there is that in Daniel 9:27, it says, he shall confirm his covenant with many for 1 week. Look down at verse 22 of Daniel 11, because it says, well, look at verse 21. It says, in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries, which is mentioned in Daniel 8 as well. And with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and he shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. So this isn't talking about Messiah the Prince. This is talking about the prince of the covenant. And this is what I believe the prince that shall come is going to confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And then you have the abomination, desolation mentioned down later. When you get down to verse 31, it says, an arm shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that make it desolate. And so You're on mute, brother.
Oh, sorry, Pastor. Can I stop you right there?
Yeah.
So I think this is a really significant point, because notice now you have they, third person plural pronoun. And so that matches up with what you were describing earlier in Daniel 9, where it's the people of the prince. And so now this seems to be, am I right? They seem to be specifying, yeah, okay, it's they, the people of whoever that prince is.
Well, and you obviously have, this is Antiochus Epiphanes, right? So
Right.
that to be said, anybody that's listening, right? No doubt what's being stated here in Daniel 11 is talking about something that had happened before Christ is even being born of the Virgin Mary and all of that. But the point that's being made is that what happened back then, though, is going to happen again.
Yes.
Right. But it's kind of like this, is that there's pieces of this that are going to happen in the future. And so you also have to be careful when you're in Daniel to not just take everything that's stated in Daniel as being something that's going to be in the future. You know,
right.
Jesus says, when he's talking about Daniel, the thing that he says is, when you shall see the abomination and desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. So we know that that is something that's future, even though this obviously happened back in the Grecian Empire, right? And so this is clearly something that we're looking back to and saying, hey, this is going to happen in the future. And obviously, Daniel 12 obviously is, I believe, talking about future events with an abomination and desolation. But there's a lot that this Antiochus Epiphanes character did, back then, that mimics what the Antichrist is going to do. And I was actually reading a little bit of your book, Brother Donny, and I love the point that you made about the little children, it is the last time. And as you have heard that Antichrist shall come, even now are there many Antichrists. And that idea of like Antiochus Epiphanes, you could even say that, I think Vespasian was the emperor when Titus, his son, is the one that was the general at the time when this was all being done, in Rome in 70 AD and everything. Because Nero was the emperor when they first started the war, but then there was what they call the year of 4 Caesars, and Vespasian was the father of Titus, and Titus eventually became emperor after that. But Titus was not emperor until later, but or Caesar. But anyway, that being said, I believe that there's a clear tie, or basically calling back to the Prince of the Covenant, which was talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, but that's going to happen in the future after the resurrection of Christ, and that I believe is something that hasn't happened yet.
So, excellent, incredible connections there. Flows with what we know about dual prophecy fulfillment. Fits the context, because you'll find a lot of people that don't believe in any kind of future fulfillment with Daniel's 70th week. They'll say, well, in the context, you don't find an Antichrist. You don't find anything of what we see largely in Revelation, let's say Revelation 13. But did you not just look at the context, Daniel 8, Daniel 9, Daniel 11, and link it all together? That, hey, we've got Antiochus Epiphanes in terms of a shadow fulfillment. But again, there's nothing new under the sun. The world works in cycles. God works in prophetic cycles. So these things have happened, and they'll happen again, but they'll happen in more of a grand scale way.
Yeah, and something to add to that, too, is that when you look in Daniel 8 and Daniel 11, it'll mention these events, but then it'll say, but the end is at the time appointed. So it kind of puts that caveat in there, like, yeah, this is something that's going to happen there, but there's like this end fulfillment. And that's where Daniel 12 comes in, where I believe it's specifically talking about the end fulfillment of, or if you want to say the ultimate fulfillment of it. So, yeah.
Well, I can already tell you. Well, you know what? But before I get too ahead of myself, let me ask you. There's so many rabbit trails you could do. What would be? Well, because I can see a couple of the preterists backstage. I know what they'll say to that, but maybe we'll save it for them. So, what's a good response to those? Because again, within the pre-wrath eschatological viewpoint, Pastor, there are some points that are agnostic, I think, where you can be pre-wrath which I believe is the best view of the timing of the rapture and also the millennium. But you can have some differences in terms of opinion on things. Daniel 9 being one of them. So you could still be pre-wrath, but believe that Daniel 9 is largely the he is Messiah, and Daniel's 70th week has been fulfilled. I'm not sure you can be a consistent pre-wrather, but you can still be pre-wrath. Anyways, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say that view of the 70th week already being fulfilled with Christ, I can see where they're coming from with that, and there's a lot of things, with Jesus Christ ministry being like 3.5 years and stuff like that. And obviously when Jesus died on the cross, the veil in the temple was rent from the top to the bottom. And according to God, obviously he no longer regarded the animal sacrifices. Right. Completely agree. So there's a lot of there's views out there when it comes to that, and the doctrine's great, as far as like how that applies doctrinal wise, but I just don't agree with that's what Daniel 9:27 is saying. And just to add this, I don't need Daniel 9:27 to prove my timeline of events. When it comes to the 3.5 years of the beginning of sorrows, and then the 3.5 years after the abomination of desolation. I believe Revelation 12 and 13 clearly show that. And so you can get the timeline just from Revelation. But to add to the 7 years being with the Antichrist is Daniel 4. Daniel 4, Nebuchadnezzar is given the heart of a beast. And he is given a heart of a beast until 7 times pass over him.
That's interesting. So
obviously, I personally believe Nebuchadnezzar got saved, but you can still have someone that's be kind of an Antichrist type, right? So Nebuchadnezzar, no doubt, he made an image that if you don't bow down to it, you're going to be killed and thrown into the burning fiery furnace. So I think most people would think that Nebuchadnezzar can kind of picture an Antichrist, but he ends up humbling himself and everything in Daniel 4, but 7 times pass over him to where his hair is like bird's feathers and his nails are like bird's claws. So you're talking 7 years. So when you think of times and half a time, you're dealing with what, 3.5 years? Well, he was a beast for 7 years. So
that's a great connection.
Another place where you can show, hey, this Antichrist is there for 7 years. So
even though the other side, like we're saying, there's 2 viable positions on Daniel 9 and the 70th week, although they have some understandable points, I can see where they're coming from. To persuade me fully that direction, I would need to see a really sophisticated counter response to these incredible connections being made on Daniel 7, 8, 9, 11, and even 12 when it comes to Antiochus Epiphanes, shadow versus literal, more dramatic fulfillment in the end times. I need to see a good response to that. One point that they like to make, so I wonder, Pastor, what you think would be the best response. They would say, well, Daniel 9 talks about the covenant right here in verse 4. And I prayed unto the Lord my God and made my confession and said, O Lord, the great and dreadful God, keeping the covenant and mercy to them that love him and to them that keep his commandments. So they'll say, well, verse 4 of Daniel 9 talks about God's covenant. Therefore, when we get down to verse 27, and he shall confirm the covenant. To be consistent in terms of Bible interpretation, this covenant should also be God's covenant rather than a covenant from an Antichrist. What do you think is a good response to that?
Yeah, so I mean, on the surface, that sounds good, but I think the thing that you have to look at is what covenant are we talking about? So there's many covenants, right? So you have what I believe Daniel 4 is talking about is the first covenant, and because it's talking about the covenant and mercy to them that love him and to them that keep his commandments. That's one of the commandments of the 10 commandments when it talks about, basically having mercy on those that love him from, to the 4th generation. But then it says, basically and I'm going to misquote that, but basically the wrath being upon them until the third or fourth generation, right, of those that hate him. But it also says confirming the words, right? So when it comes to this, verse 12 there, it says, and he hath confirmed his words, which he hath spoken against us. When you look at the law in Deuteronomy, it literally lays out the fact that they, the punishment that they would have for disobeying him. And actually the punishment was based off of the fact they didn't keep the yearly Sabbaths. So the reason that they were there, they were in captivity for 70 years, is because they weren't keeping the yearly Sabbath. So that means that for like 490 years, they weren't keeping that Sabbath, which is interesting because 70 weeks of years is 490 years. And so it all kind of ties, into, what's going to happen next with the next future amount of time. But that being said, is that the covenant that they would say is being referred to in verse 27 would either have to be the new covenant, or would have to be maybe them talking about Abraham's covenant, or the covenant to Abraham. And so the covenant to Abraham was that through his seed, or through him and his seed, would all the nations of the earth be blessed, because through him Christ came, right? So that was a promise to Abraham. And then the new covenant obviously is we know that to be, obviously, Jesus is the mediator in the blood of the everlasting covenant there, right? So it wouldn't really match up. And I get off first cup, you see covenant and you see covenant, but they're two different covenants that are being mentioned there. If their interpretation is correct, you'd still be seeing two different covenants. And so that would be my answer to that.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. Plus, covenant just means an agreement or league. So in Daniel 11, you find Antiochus Epiphanes making a covenant. They use the word league, but that's synonymous with covenant.
But right before that, it says the prince of the covenant,
Yeah.
So
yeah, right there's an interesting point too.
The thing is too, that's interesting with this, when you think of the foreshadowing, it says that the prince of the covenant is broken. And when you think about what's going to happen with the Antichrist, is that he's going to die, and he's going to ascend out of the bottomless pit, right? He's going to have the deadly wound that's healed. And it's interesting that the prince of the covenant there is broken, but then he's raised up. It talks about him coming up after that. And then what happens after that? The abomination of desolation.
Yeah. That's a great point. That's a great connection right there. So we see, as you said, these things have happened. What I find interesting, I got a slide on it comparing, but I don't, for sake of time, I won't try and find it, but I've got it compared with Revelation 13 and also Daniel 8, where it's actually the dragon that is giving influence and power unto these Antichrist types like Antiochus Epiphanes, and also the end times Antichrist. So ultimately, this is done through the prince of darkness, the serpent, the dragon, Satan. He's the one giving these guys powers anyway. So it makes sense that these things happen again and again and again, because it's through the devil's attempts to basically take control of the world, pinky and brain style.
Yeah, there's actually, going on from that as well, is that, I was reading through Daniel again, just kind of, because we were going to be talking about end-time prophecy, but is the fact that in Daniel 11:14, that it talks about like the people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. And it's interesting because it seems like there's this constant, like the devil's constantly trying to fulfill this, right? He's like trying to do this with different people, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And he tried it with Antiochus Epiphanes, didn't, it obviously did something, but it's not the ultimate fulfillment of it, So.
Yeah, evil people, through the influence of the dragon and Satan, they try to take over the world and take control and have their war against humanity in the same way. But as we progress to the end times, things become more sophisticated and advanced, like technology. People spread out to all parts of the globe. But that wasn't the case in 70 AD, which is why we have localized descriptions in Matthew 24. But then the analog in Revelation 6 to be specific, it's worldwide, it's more cataclysmic. Revelation 13, it's more sophisticated in its nature, right? The mark of the beast clearly could only be fulfilled in today's day and age with technological advancements.
Yeah, and Luke 21, Well, and I think people don't realize too, when you're dealing with Matthew 24 and Luke 21, for example, Luke 21 was not the sermon. It was not an Olivet discourse. It was spoken at the temple, and then he went up to the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives, he spoke to 4 disciples privately. When you think of Matthew 24 and Mark 13, so what I believe is going on there is that you have like this overlap of the things that were going to happen in the near future about like Jerusalem being encompassed with armies, and obviously it was going to be destroyed. That really does kind of overlap with that first portion of what we see in the end times, and that it's very similar. So that's why I think a lot of people will then say, well, this happened in the past, so this all is all done. But the elephant in the room when it comes to the preterist argument is Jesus coming in the clouds.
Yeah.
Like,
right.
Where do you draw the line? Like, it's like they just don't draw the line at all. And therefore, you're just out to lunch at that point if you think that Jesus is already coming in the clouds and he's gathered together his elect and all that stuff's already done.
Great points. I'm glad you pointed that out. I'll point out this last thing, then we'll open it up for 20 minutes of questions. And it's been comprehensive. This is what I want. This is what I wanted. So you're doing a great job, Pastor Robinson. A lot of this stuff is technical. It's the meat of the word, end times theology.
Just so you know, I don't know everything when it comes to
You're being humble.
the end times prophecy and everything. But obviously, this is where I stand. This is what I believe. And like you said, when it comes to end times prophecy, I mean, this is a secondary issue.
Yeah.
Obviously, salvation is the number one thing, that we're saved by grace through faith. But it is still an important topic, though, I believe. So,
well, here's the thing. If you could understand the Bible, everything about it in a year, that would be boring. I mean, God wants us to keep studying, to keep learning, to keep growing, excelling in our spiritual education. So it's an amazing thing that you could live 100 years and still only scratch the surface of God's word.
yeah, that's true.
So last thing I wanted to point out, not that the apocryphal books or Maccabees are authoritative in any way, but a lot of what they say do line up to history, and a lot of what they say don't. But in this case, it does. Maccabees, I just find it interesting that this lines up perfectly with Daniel 8 and Daniel 11 and history, that Antiochus Epiphanes worked with apostate Jews. They felt that Israel was constantly under attack and cursed. And so they decided to go against the one true God and work with Antiochus Epiphanes and the heathen. And so it says, let us go and make a covenant with the heathen. And who's making that covenant? Antiochus Epiphanes. And then in Daniel 11, it says league. So it's not made up to say that, hey, an antichrist will show up in the future, make some kind of deal, make some kind of agreement. He'll come in peaceably, but he's actually working deceitfully, because we've already seen this take place in the past.
Yeah, and I think he even takes that covenant even a step further when he starts making people take the mark of the beast.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So